Hello readers, I'm David Reader and today we're reviewing The End of History and the Last Man, written by Francis Fukuyama in 1992. So this book basically states the idea that liberal democracy is the best system of government, both economically and politically, and that there is a tendency for the world of moving closer and closer towards it, and that there aren't any realistic alternatives since all the other alternatives have very strong contradictions, while liberal democracy has weak contradictions, which it can manage. So this book is in 5 parts, and the first part discusses the inherent weaknesses in authoritarian states and why there will be a liberal revolution. So with fascism or Nazism, while that ideology is very warlike, so eventually it will lead to its downfall as it overreaches too much and it will be defeated by other states. With juntas or conservative dictatorships, as we saw in the Cold War with Spain, Greece, Portugal, or Latin America, well, here it is to preserve certain values or a certain institution like the Catholic Church. So inherently that's a temporary system of government. Also, they tend to economically liberalize in the end. So Francoist Spain eventually implemented capitalist reforms, and once the so-called threat has been resolved, such as destroying the left-wing militias in Latin America, or you have had a lot of economic development, so now you have people who want democracy, while the regime may give up power voluntarily, especially when the institutions that they supposedly protect are opposed to it now and want liberal democracy. So for example, the Catholic Church in Spain or in Latin America, eventually they decided that this authoritarianism isn't good, so eventually these juntas gave up power voluntarily. So Southern Europe is democratic now, and almost all of Latin America is democratic. It's unstable, sure, it's poor, sure, but now it has both political liberalism and to a certain extent economic liberalism, and now these countries are much richer. With communism, that's initially a totalitarian ideology, so you've got Stalin or Mao, but once these people die and these states have become much poorer now, the leadership decides it isn't good to operate under a system where we may all die, because in totalitarianism, up to the second highest ranking person can be killed. So it's in the interest of someone like Khrushchev to liberalize the system slightly politically, and when you start liberalizing things politically slightly, then you will have dissent, and then it will be revealed the inherent flaws in the economic system. So then eventually you will have a reformer like Gorbachev, who introduces a little more political liberalism. Then there will be demand for economic liberalism, and these communist regimes will collapse. And since the Soviet Union was made up of a bunch of ethnic groups, once this highly authoritarian communism was abandoned, then the Soviet Union collapsed. And then in China, although you had the repression through the Tiananmen Square, it still indicated that now through the economic development that Deng Xiaoping introduced, you have a class of intellectuals who are demanding recognition of their rights. So now basically you barely have any communist regimes left. I mean, you've got North Korea, and you kind of have Cuba and Venezuela, but apart from those regimes, pretty much all of the world has to some extent embraced capitalism, although some of these regimes are highly corrupt, so it hasn't fully been implemented. The second part talks about universal historical trends. So here Fukuyama claims that history progresses. It doesn't go through cycles really, as the ancient Greeks believes, as when the scientific method and natural sciences have been developed, then you will have economic progress, and people do not want to go back in time to where they were more poor. So that is why you have more dictatorships in backwards countries. Sometimes with these heavily industrializing societies, you might have a dictatorship that comes along, such as in Italy or in Germany, but it is temporary, and people don't want to go back to poverty or stagnation, so they want more and more economic development, so that makes democracy more stable. So here you have desire linked with economic development, and why Europe barely has any dictatorships right now. And the argument to revert back to nature doesn't really work when people like their things. Like me, I don't want to go back to a time where I'm gonna die because I don't get vaccinated. Part 3 discusses the 3 inherent things in humans, which is they have desire, they can use reason to accomplish it, and then they have Thymos. Now, Thymos is basically the desire for recognition, and a lot of this is based on Hegel, while using reason to accomplish desire, that is much more based on Lockean liberalism, when political institutions such as constitutional and republican governments try to tame Thymos through Leviathan, for example, that's more Hobbes' ideas. So the desire for recognition originally started with 2 people duking it out, and the one who submits and recognizes the other person becomes the slave, the one who wins becomes the master. But you cannot really be recognized by someone who is subhuman, and the slave will not really like being treated as subhuman, he will not be recognized. And with Thymos, you have 2 kinds of it. You have megalothymia, or you believe that you should be recognized as superior to others. And then you have isotamia, which is where you believe that you should be recognized as inherently equal to everyone else. So this is what Martin Luther King believed. So that's not exactly equality of opportunity, but it's a basic belief that all people are equal, and this has a tendency to lead to democracy. And megalotamia shifts in a liberal democracy. So when you have a dictatorship or warlike societies, people will prove themselves by conquering or going to war. But that is irrational because people believe in their own self-preservation. That's why the slave submitted, by the way. So they believe in an economic system where they will be able to achieve their desires through reason. So people who are megalotamia, they will no longer really seek power, but they will contribute to the economy by being successful entrepreneurs. And although they request to be recognized as superior to others, they will still contribute and develop society. While the belief of isotamia, well, that helps eliminating slavery, racism, and also the ethnic nationalism you have. So imperialism is the belief of your own superiority, so then you will go and conquer things. But once you have the introduction of isotamia, there will be a tendency for this to get destroyed. So that is why British originally they had their empire in the 1800s, and then they freely give it up in the mid-1940s or 1950s. Fukuyama basically believes that liberal economics plus politics lead to the Thymotic drive of satisfaction. So under every other system of politics and economics, you will not have the Thymotic satisfaction, either under communism, fascism, or juntas. Liberal democracy is the best system. And it is true that you will not completely achieve this goal, but it's the system where it is most achieved. In part 4, Fukuyama discusses the alternative views where he demonstrates how they're wrong. So first of all, Fukuyama says you don't really have any preconditions to create a liberal democracy that are needed. They can make it easier for liberal democracy to come along, such as the middle class, but it is not necessary. So the United States, for example, was a pre-industrial society when it became a democracy. And Fukuyama states that you have some irrational Thymotic desires that still help uphold democracy. So for example, the nuclear family, or the work ethic. They're not really rational per se, but they help economic development. You can have a heavy emphasis on economic development without individual rights, which is shown in Asia, where the family or the group is more important than the individual. And where you have formal democracies in many countries such as Japan, but people still voluntarily vote for a collectivistic system, which is capitalistic, but where you follow the group or where you work very hard. So that is the justification, for example, behind the semi-dictatorship you have in Singapore. That is why the Japanese work very hard, not for themselves as they do in the United States, but for the group. And then extreme Islam is an irrational ideology in the Islamic world. But Fukuyama points out that these ideologies are reasonable and will not come to America or Europe. Political Islam stays in the Islamic world, and then these Asian collectivistic values, they will stay in Asia. They will not come to the United States, which is too much individualistic and liberal for this to happen. Fukuyama also says that realism is no longer really relevant when analyzing things in some places. So realism, Fukuyama argues, is a lot about perception. So the communist world viewed everything through a realist lens. So then it was justified for the democratic world to view the communist world through a realist lens and to view them as enemies and to be suspicious of them. But there is no reason for Holland to be afraid of Denmark. There is no reason for France to be afraid of Germany anymore, because it's not in their economic self-interest to do so. Trade, political liberalism, and using reason to achieve desires will prevent these countries from going to war with each other. This is basically the theory of democratic peace thesis. You will never have a war between two liberal democracies. You can use a realist lens in the dictatorial world, but it no longer makes any sense to use it in Western Europe or in North America. And same thing is true with Latin America and some parts of Asia and Africa now. The balance of power is not relevant in Western Europe, because there's an argument by realism that the reason that all of Western Europe is allied is because it's afraid of Russia. Russia was not dangerous in the 90s. It was a weak state. And yet there was no war in Western Europe. And the war in Yugoslavia at this time did not escalate to a full-blown world war as it did with World War I. Because these are regional conflicts and they will not expand to the liberal world. And through this political and economic liberalism, these national identification barriers, German, French, are reduced because they both see that it's beneficial to cooperate, such as in the European Union. And Fukuyama also discussed that a large part with the United Nations is that it is made up by a lot of dictatorships. So you should have a coalition of liberal democracies, which is what NATO is, for example, which is ready to protect itself against dictatorships. And in the fifth and final part, Fukuyama discusses the modern man and liberal democracy as an end in itself, and how that world operates. So democracy is based on two things, equality especially, but also liberty. However, you have to view this as a trade-off. You cannot have absolute equality and liberty. Absolute equality, they tried to achieve that in the Soviet world, but that could not work because you need a powerful man to achieve this, so it's an inherent contradiction. While for economic development, you need megalothemia. You need entrepreneurs who want more and more money, not really because they want to spend it, but as something to show that they have succeeded in life and are better than others. This will be balanced by azotemia, with the desire for people to have self-esteem and to be recognized as equals. This is why, for example, we build ramps for people in wheelchairs to keep dignity for them, and this is why we have social programs to help the poor. And the level of equality versus liberty you choose to have is not exactly the same in all liberal countries, but you have elements of both in all of them. So equality is a big focus in Scandinavia, for example, while liberty is more of a focus in the United States, but both of these values are partially followed in both Europe and North America. Now, of course, they're more and more followed in Latin America and Asia and partially Africa. And in a liberal society, you have deeper values than liberalism, such as the work ethic, the nuclear family, Christian values, and these things are necessary to keep a liberal democracy healthy. And these things may partially decline, so that's not really good for liberal democracy, but they will remain partially there. So liberal democracy will still stay quite healthy and probably won't backslide. And Fukuyama also concludes with the thing, so Hegel discussed that you're only truly free when you're ready to sacrifice yourself for a cause. Which I'm gonna say here, no. When you're drafted, you're basically a slave. I mean, if you're sent to fight off a war without your free volition, you're not really a free person. It's not your own choice. Freedom is when you choose something. But eventually, Fukuyama argues, you will have a spiritual revolution in a sense, or a liberal revolution, where people understand that some things are irrational. The Thymotic desires is also linked to using reason to achieve your desires. So you will have less war in some places. Places will become less militaristic, and government will be ready to cooperate more and more through economic liberalism. And they will also implement the institutions of political liberalism. And those are the conclusions of Francis Fukuyama in his End of History and the Last Man. So how would I rate The End of History and the Last Man by Fukuyama? I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. Now, I agree with most of the conclusions of Fukuyama, and I really love his idea that you need a coalition of liberal democracies instead of having a United Nations, which includes a lot of dictatorships. My main problem with this book is, however, that he uses Hegel a lot. That he basically claims that Hegel is superior to Hobbes or Locke. And the thing with Hegel is that he doesn't believe in objective truth. That's the same thing with Immanuel Kant and the critique of pure reason. In the end, everything is based on facts, including emotions. It can be explained away by facts and reason. It can be explained why it's bad. Keep in mind when you're reading this book, and this is especially apparent in the third part, that this thing of Thymos, while I believe that Thymos is just a subsection of desire, and it can be unhealthy or healthy. Megalothemia can be harnessed well into economic growth, or it can turn bad into a dictatorship or war. While isothemia, it is good to view people as equal under the law, but trying to achieve equality is bad. While this book is good overall, the major flaw is that Fukuyama uses a philosopher who can be used to justify the opposite ideas than this book. So, depending on how you interpret Hegel, and this is what usually happens, you are led to Marxist conclusions or fascist conclusions. Hegel does not usually lead to liberal conclusions. But overall, Fukuyama shows how liberal democracy is superior to other systems of government, and that it is the final system of government in history. And this is where history and the last man come to an end in some countries. Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and some other countries now, they are in their final form of government. There may be disagreement over lesser issues, over equality and liberty. This is why you have democracy and why people can vote, and why you have an economic system where people can achieve their desires. But fundamentally, the desire for recognition has been tamed. However, this discussion of the desire of recognition, it needs to be understood that the desire for recognition kind of leads to narcissism in a sense. People believing that they deserve more or equal things to other people, even though they haven't worked as hard. That's a very dangerous conclusion. So while this is a decent book, a 7 out of 10, I would also recommend you to read books on economics, such as reading some economics book by Thomas Sowell or Henry Hazlitt. So you get the understanding why the desire to achieve equality, full equality at least, between unequal people is irrational. So a decent book, but it undervalues economics. So this was the average reader's review of The End of History and the Last Man, written by Francis Fukuyama in 1992. It got a 7 out of 10. I hope you readers enjoyed this book review, and I will see you readers next time.